Thank you and welcome to the show this morning. The topic this morning is Reconstruction and Reunification of the South after the Civil War. And we're fortunate to have with us to talk about this very, very significant and important historical topic, Dr. RMitchell from Fisk University. And of course, Dr. Mitchell, let me welcome you to the show this morning.
Thank you, Dr. Haynes. It's a pleasure to be invited.
And to tell you, Dr. Mitchell, how indeed happy we are to have you here. This is the beginning of a new season for us, and we've had you on just numerous of times, a number of times, yes. And each time, as we said before, you bring us such excellent information. As a matter of fact, we often think about the video that we did with you on slavery and the Emancipation Proclamation and all of those things. And so what we'd like to do today, Dr. Mitchell, is to recognize that this is really the beginning of the voting season here, and so to sort of bring a topic in that would deal with the suffrage and the whole problems that came out of the Reconstruction of the South. But before we get into that, Dr. Mitchell, let's have you to give us some information about your background, your education, and what in a real sense motivated you to do the things that you're doing.
Well, thank you, Dr. Haney. It's been wonderful over the last almost 30 years now. I've been on the faculty at Fisk for 20 years. I'm a native of Nashville, educated in the Catholic and public schools of Nashville, attended undergraduate school at Fisk, and did a master's degree at Tennessee State and a doctoral degree at Middle Tennessee State. But I guess this morning I'm going to rather surprise you. I was looking back over some notes, and 30 years ago this year in 1972, I was invited to Vanderbilt to hear a young professor who they had brought there named James Haney.
Okay, that's a long time.
I was brand new faculty at MTSU, and you reach a point in life where you're looking through your notes and papers.
Okay.
And there was a young man there with a large afro and a dashiki named James Haney, and I was down at MTSU. We were beginning our teaching careers.
That's exactly it. And of course, that's what when we met one another.
That's right.
That's been a long time.
So it's been, I think, good over the years. The things we've discussed and really the popularization of history. It's really made the teaching of where students come to college now with a great yearning and desire to know about our national past. Since September 11th, one year ago, or year 2001, Americans have tried to find their place in the world. So it's still a thrilling profession discussing American history, and particularly African-American history.
Okay, I'll tell you, Dr. Mitchell, let's talk about the period of Reconstruction, the period that followed immediately after the war. And I think you noticed that when we introduced the topic today, we said Reconstruction and Reunification of the South after the Civil War, and et cetera. Let's talk about that, and let's have you to start talking about it by talking about what you consider to be the Reconstruction period in American history, and sort of bring our audience into what we're doing.
The Reconstruction period is one of the most vital periods in the country's history. Generally, when history is taught, high school and college level, we teach it from exploration to 1865. We pick up with the war and Reconstruction. I tell people the Reconstruction period did for me as an African American what the end of the American Revolution did not do. It provided me with the vote. It freed me. So it's what we call a watershed event in United States history. What we sometimes don't realize is that it was a great political struggle. So a political struggle between a North and a South that had been engaged in war for several years. But it was also a political struggle between a president and the Congress. Reconstruction was not easy. Reconstruction was not intended to be easy. Abraham Lincoln, who really did not believe the country could be divided by war, wanted to make the Reconstruction process quick. He wanted the country back in place. He couldn't deal with a disunited Union. But members of his own party, the Republican Party, who had fought that war, disagreed. They wanted to make Reconstruction of the South by Southerners virtually impossible. They wanted to collect emotion from a war effort. They wanted to punish the South. So as much as Reconstruction may be painted as reunion, before there could be reunion, there had to be a bit of disunion. As the young people said, we had to pay for the crimes. And in the eyes of Northern Republicans, radicals within Lincoln's party, the crime had been ever leaving the Union. So there's a struggle. Reconstruction is a point of struggle. Politics, Lincoln initially wanted 10% of the South, 10% of those who had voted in the election of 1850 to swear allegiance. But then you've got to look at who voted in 1850. Women didn't vote. Certainly black people didn't vote. And those who didn't own land didn't vote. So only a small percentage of those actually voted. Of that, he only wanted 10% to swear allegiance, and he would declare states reunited.
Now, is this what they meant by Lincoln having what might be considered a very, very mild and very sympathetic policy toward the South?
And really, it was towards the South, but really it was his support of the Union. He wanted that Union back and functioning. This is what he'd argued the war was fought about, and many people miss the fact that the war wasn't fought as much about slavery as it was about maintaining the Union.
Go on.
Maintaining that Union. Lincoln hoped that the Union would be back and functioning within a year. Unfortunately, there's such a disunion in the country that Lincoln's assassination is brought on by the question of this reuniting the Union. The ultimate question were those Southerners who were upset with Lincoln. He had the radicals, they're upset with Lincoln. Lincoln really is in a state where he can't carry out what he wishes. When his bill goes to the Congress, his Wade Davis bill that brought about Reconstruction, it doesn't go anyplace. The Congress stifles it. Then they bring forth a bill, and when that bill comes to Lincoln, the radical plan, he lets it lay on his desk and lets Congress go out of session. He exercises his pocket veto. So the struggle that ensues after the Civil War is as much a battle between a president and Congress as we've ever experienced. Presently, in the world situation where we're looking at the events and planning war, or looking at war, and there's a struggle between the president and the Congress, that's very reminiscent of that era after Reconstruction. It's a detrimental era for the entire nation. It's very detrimental for the South. It's very detrimental for African Americans because caught up in the struggle, we are exploited, we are exploited. So we have to look at an actual struggle. Finally, it's decided that the Army of the North will occupy the South. And there will be a period of time before there will be voting in the South. They decide, those who control the Congress decide, that they want the Southern states to swear they had always been loyal. And to many of the Southern state leaders, this was upsetting because they hadn't been loyal. They had formed a confederacy. They had formed a separate union. So the struggle for Reconstruction continues. Caught up in that struggle will be the emancipation and the vote of the black man. And there was nothing more troubling to Southerners than to see those who were formerly enslaved suddenly marching to the polls and voting. And so
Dr. Mitchell, as we near this first commercial break that we have here today, we find that in this whole struggle that will erupt after the war, which is to say that this is almost a continuation of the intensity of the emotions between the North and the South. It might no longer be the battle as such, but it is emotional and quite involved. But now, one of the things that we'd like for you to talk about after we come back from this break is the citizenship rights of Africans during this time, because I think we know that in 1865, the 13th Amendment is passed that will give them freedom.
That's right.
But now the 14th Amendment, that's this whole idea of African-American citizenship. I think that's one of the most important elements that we could deal with at this particular point, I mean, in this part of the show this morning.
Exactly. And we will always remember that freedom and equality are not synonymous.
Good, very good. And of course, after we take this first commercial break, we'll come back and we'll give you an opportunity to talk about the Reconstruction Act of 1867 and how Africans were eventually brought into the whole political process, because there were quite a bit of opposition in the South and to a lesser degree in the northern states in reference to African-American participation in politics and citizenship and whatnot. And I want you to sort of lay that out as you so well do in some of these other parts that we've dealt with before. And of course, we'll be back with our audience following this very, very short commercial break.
It's a scorching hot day. Imagine being trapped in a parked car. The temperature inside is rising. Now imagine that you're wearing a fur coat. Leaving your dog in a hot car is not only uncomfortable, it's dangerous. If it's too hot for you, it's far worse for him because, unlike us, he can't perspire to cool down, and within minutes, the temperature, even with the windows down a little, can exceed 100 degrees. So on warm days, please be kind. Leave your dog safely at home.
Hi, I'm Tricia Yearwood. I lost both my grandmothers to lung cancer. To learn more about lung cancer and women, call 1-866-HER-CANCER.
Someday, I'll be a ballerina, just like them. Someday, this won't just be my wish. Someday, I won't be sick.
Dear Abby, I'm scared. I think my mom is showing signs of Alzheimer's disease. What should I do? Signed, Frightened. Dear Frightened, when my mom first began showing signs of memory loss, I was scared too. So I called the Alzheimer's Association for help. I'm Dear Abby. If you or someone you love is experiencing memory loss, take my advice, contact the Alzheimer's Association. They help families like ours.
Thank you, and welcome back to the second segment of the show for today. The topic is the reunification of the South after the Civil War, or Reconstruction. And of course, we're talking to the professor of history at Fisk University, Dr. RMitchell. And of course, Dr. Mitchell, we promised that during this second segment we would allow you to talk about African-American political participation during this period and how Africans became involved in the whole political process and the influence of their involvement during the time.
Well, the beginning is the 13th Amendment, which frees the slaves. And one of the sort of misnomers of history, Lincoln issued a proclamation of emancipation, but it really freed no slaves. The proclamation was aimed at those southern states. It was a more war measure. It said if they didn't cease fighting, their slaves would be free. But none of the South coalesced to his demands. So slavery continued to the end of the war. It was an act of Congress, the 13th Amendment, which freed the slaves. Again, it's the radical Republicans. And as wonderful an act as freeing the slaves was, it was also a way of saying to the South that these people who you've held, these people who much of your economy is based upon, and slavery was an economic activity, are now free. The 14th Amendment will make them citizens of the United States. And then amendments follow, the 15th and whatever, and they're given the vote. Again, as wonderful as the act was, as marvelous as it was, it's also a continuation of that struggle between the North and the South. Suddenly, this Congress, still seen as Northern because the Southern states have been reconstructed, goes in and provides the vote. It puts together a whole new electorate in the South, a large population, which for a brief period of time, the late 1860s, will control the Southern vote. So once you have Reconstruction and blacks are allowed to vote, the Dunning School of Historians, William they describes it as black Reconstruction.
Very good.
The blackness is the fact that some few blacks hold office, never a majority. One interesting political point, though, once black people have the vote, once those former slaves and many of those free blacks who were never slaves have the vote, they aren't terribly punitive. We don't find during black Reconstruction blacks demanding any punishment of the South. The federal Congress would disenfranchise those Confederate leaders who were wealthy, those who were leaders in the Southern governments. They would be in prison. But it wasn't acts of black legislatures. It would, in fact, throughout the South, during black Reconstruction, you really find a time when black members of state legislatures, black members of city councils and all, will reestablish and rebuild the South. In Tennessee, for example, the Tennessee legislature, once blacks are a member of it, Samuel McElwee will propose public education. You had never had public education in the South prior to the Civil War. It's during black Reconstruction. Public education for all groups in the South. Certainly this meant for the former slaves a chance, the greatest chance for education. When blacks vote, at national elections, they will send 2 senators. And it was only during this political time that we will have 2 black members of the Senate, Hiram Revels and Blanche Kelso Bruce, out of Mississippi. And again, they put forth very progressive legislation. It's under Kelso Bruce that we see the establishment of public education and public colleges in Mississippi. The University of Mississippi is strengthened, but there's also the creation of Alcorn, AMN. There's also the creation of colleges for African Americans. We see schools and hospitals. So during this period, even though there's chaos, we find valuable assistance by African Americans to the American dream. The question is, though, still at the national level, many in the South are upset, they are chagrined, there's still this struggle. The question of why black Reconstruction was so disfavored in the South, because again, it took this electorate and it empowered them, it gave them control. When after Lincoln's unfortunate assassination, a second president, Andrew Johnson, from Tennessee, comes to power. Andrew Johnson also is no friend of the African American. He's not pro support for African Americans. He is pro, however, in supporting the Northern viewpoint. He's pro-union, which is not synonymous with being pro-African American. Andrew Johnson once stated he wished he could relieve the drudgery of every white family by providing them with free slaves. So that's not a man who's pro-African American, but he is pro-union. He follows Lincoln's situation. He follows Lincoln's demand. So while Reconstruction is going on, the political battles continue between those who want to see the Union reunited, but also those who want to punish the South. The biggest struggle develops within the Republican Party, the radical and liberal wing. And what they're most radical about is the treatment of the South. In this, though, the nation moves for 20 years, and there's a struggle. Eventually, there'll be a compromise. Politically, the compromise will be the removal of federal troops from the South. The Union is reunited, but the African American vote is gradually disappeared. New legislatures begin to put in new rules. There are no troops left in the South to make sure that African Americans can vote. Intimidation becomes a part of the political process. Voters are intimidated. Voters are outright not allowed to vote. Voting precincts, voting records are not kept. Votes are cast in African American precincts, and eventually the great hope of the Civil War diminishes.
And so when you talk about the military rule of the South, explain that, because I think what you're saying here is that for a time, after the war, that the military, the national military, actually controls and rules. Talk about this. Occupied the South. Now, what are you saying
here
there?
in Tennessee, the general in charge was Clinton B. Fisk. Consequently, when a school is open, it's named after a general, but they occupy the South. They treat it as conquered territory. Southerners are treated as those who were defeated in war. The great irony is that the 2 national leaders, Lincoln and Johnson, didn't want to alienate Southern voters. They hoped for reunion, but you couldn't have that. So the main point that Southern leaders want in this period of Reconstruction, the first most visible sign of reunion they want is the removal of federal troops. But once those troops are removed, who is going to protect the former slaves?
Now, did these troops actually protect the slaves while they were there? I mean, what was the relationship between
them? They protected the federal government's interest. Many of them oversaw the construction of railroads. Consequently, here in Nashville, you have a Union station built by the Union Army. One of the desires of the Army was to facilitate the railroads so the South could be brought back into business and businesses. And there was a great amount of money in rebuilding the South. Important northern companies make that money. And actually, some scholars point out that the African Americans compromised by the rebuilding of the South. The North and the South